Hi, and welcome to today's Academy on Air. My name is Claire, and I'm on the mobile transformation team here at Google. And what that means is I work with our advertisers to transform their mobile experiences. So I work on topics like mobile UX, web performance, conversion rate optimization, so that customers can drive value from their mobile advertising and basically delight their users. So today we're going to be talking about the importance of mobile site speed and how to make the most of your mobile marketing. A lot of times I look at a lot of sites, about 100 per year, and we see some really common threads when it comes to the importance of performance and the problems that companies have. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how you can make more out of your mobile marketing, make it more efficient, and why you should really be focusing on mobile site speed. So before we jump into it, I want to talk a little bit about this. So who remembers this back from the 90s? Hopefully a decent amount of people tuning in. If not, you're too young. But so dial-up internet back in the day. This today is the dial-up internet of our era, which is slow mobile phones and that white screen or that spinning icon that everyone experiences every once in a while, and it's really frustrating. We want to see content, we want to get it fast, quickly. We're very impatient. And on average, we take our phones about 100 times a day for 60 seconds. So if you're spending a decent amount of that time waiting for a screen to load, you're probably going to go elsewhere. So last week we talked a little bit about what makes a good mobile experience, and I talked a bit about mobile UX and design. But the first pillar of this is really speed. And the reason I want to focus on speed today is because you can have a great design experience, you can be completely mobile optimized, but if your site takes 10 or 15 seconds to load, especially on faulty connections, those that are slower, you're probably losing customers. And so we're going to focus in on speed and talk a little bit first about why it's important. So again, in terms of agenda, talk about the importance. Second, we'll look at a couple tools to identify some of these speed issues. Some you might be familiar with. Some are more developer-oriented, but I think are great for marketers to understand so that they can talk to their developers about some of these common problems. And then we're actually going to go into a few of the common problems that we most frequently see. And a lot of these are really easy to fix. They actually only take a few hours of development time and can really help improve that mobile user experience. The other thing I want to make sure is that we get to some Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, make sure to add them to the live chat, and I will try to get to them at the end of the presentation. And before we jump in, I really do want to tee up the new mobile site certification. If you are at all interested in mobile speed, if you are a developer and you want to prove your skills, that you know all of the best practices around mobile, go check out the mobile site certification through the partners portal. This is new, it was just launched, and it's really a place where you can show off your skills. So in terms of what you learn is an understanding of mobile best practices in terms of the technical side of things and UX. You'll also learn about current browser technologies. So especially if you're interested in things like accelerated mobile pages or AMP, or understanding a little bit more about progressive web apps, which are some new technologies, you'll learn a bit about those as well. So you can go online, you can take the free e-learning, take the exam, create a partner's profile if you don't already have one, and then you can actually promote that ability. So especially if you're an agency that does development, or if you just want to kind of prove that you know what you're talking about, you can share that on your public profile, on your company profile, or even on your LinkedIn. So definitely recommend, if you want to learn more, along with the things that we're going to cover today, check out the mobile site certification. All right, so let's talk a bit about why speed is so important and why focusing on speed, especially for mobile, at the end of the day ends up being revenue and profit in the door. A really common saying that we like to say is speed thrills, friction kills, and you really want to try to eliminate that friction that the user might be experiencing. So before we get into it, would you want to wait in this line? Imagine you are at a grocery store and you are just buying a carton of milk, and there's one line that has 10 people in it with full baskets, and then there's the express line over to the right where everyone has less than 5 items and there's only 2 people in line. I don't think many people would choose the really long one. This is a pretty easy answer, but it's a really good analogy for mobile site speed and how impatient we really are. We're not really going to choose to wait. And so DoubleClick did this study last year to kind of put some numbers to this, which is how long do we actually wait? And they found that 53% of people on average abandon a website if it takes more than 3 seconds to load, which is a pretty low barrier to entry. We're really used to the sites and the apps that we use every day being really fast. So the Amazons, Googles, I don't know if anyone's ever noticed, but we actually show the speed of our search results at the top of every single page. So speed is something that matters a lot to us, and especially as the ecosystem gets faster, people are noticing more and more if a site is slow. Additionally, what is the impact of 1 second delay on load time? This is where it gets to the key KPIs that you guys care about. So if anything, pay attention to this. Talk to your developers about why this matters. But a 1 second delay on load time is an 8.3% increase in bounce rate on average, a 3.5% decrease in conversion rate. If you're a retailer and e-commerce, a 2.1 decrease in cart size, and a 9.4 decrease in page views in terms of percentage. And so these are some really key stats in terms of what poor load time could mean for your site and for the KPIs that you care about as marketers. So what is a good load time? We get this question a lot, 3 seconds. There's a lot of things floating out there. I think that this study really hones in on what that actually ends up being. So we see that mobile pages load 1% faster, see a 27% increase in CVR. And so this was a study done by SOSTA, which is a web performance analytics company that we worked with. And they actually took some sites and throttled them and then looked at the impact on conversion rate and bounce rate. So here you can see bounce rate, going from something like 10 seconds to 3 seconds. Really, you see this sharp decline. But this is where I think it's really interesting. So if you have a site that's 10 seconds going to 6 seconds, not a ton of movement in terms of CVR, because a lot of people are still bouncing at this point. They're getting frustrated. They're going to move on to the next site. But when you go from something like 6 seconds to 3 seconds, this is when you get these really huge incremental gains in conversion rate. And so this is why we really do recommend that people aim for about 3 seconds on a 3G network. And I do want to caveat this with 2 things. So the first is that this was all tested on 3G. And the reason that we recommend using 3G is because it's still the national average in terms of connection speeds, especially in the US. If you're tuning in from elsewhere, it might be a bit different. But 3G is about 30 to 40% of connection speeds. So in terms of marketing, you don't want to be alienating potentially 30% of the people who would come to your site. So we recommend optimizing for 3G. And if someone has a better experience, that's wonderful. But you want to have a good site experience for every single one of the users that comes to your site. The second question that we get a lot is, what is load time? There's a lot of definitions. Is it full page load? Is it time to first byte? And what we're looking at in terms of load time here, and what we typically optimize towards, is the load of the above the fold content. And we see that as that's what really correlates to what the user sees and what they feel. It's that kind of core user experience. Do I see the stuff I'm immediately looking for? Do I see a menu and the brand image? Does the page look usable, or is there a bunch of white space? So the load of the above the fold content is what we focus in on. And there's a few ways to measure this. I think the easiest is through a tool called Web Page Test, which we'll go through later. And it has a metric called Speed Index that measures exactly that. So we'll go through that in a bit. The other question we get a lot is, what's the drop off on the left? And if your page is loading in under 2 seconds on a 3G network, unless you're on something like AMP, probably a 404 page or a page with a lot of content. So again, this kind of proves why we recommend optimizing towards around 3 seconds and trying to do that on 3G. So the good news is that there are a few quick fixes that can knock off about 30 to 50% of your site's load times and the problems that you may be experiencing. And so the goal of today, again, is just to use a few tools to actually audit your site. You can do this in real time. I recommend everyone kind of follow along if they have a site that they're thinking about or their company site. Go ahead and get that pulled up in your browser and on your mobile phone. And then use this as a conversation to talk to your developers about some of these common issues. So tools. Let's talk about the tools that you can use as marketers to identify some of these speed problems. The first one, hopefully most of you are familiar with, is Test My Site. Test My Site was made by Google, and you can go put in your URL, very similar to PageSpeed Insights as well, as if anyone has used that. But Test My Site identifies Google's best practices when it comes to speed and identifies areas of improvement. So again, this is a first step that you can have with conversations. And there's actually a feature now where you can actually download some of the optimized assets. So things like images or compressed code, there's actually the option to go ahead and download those. They've already been losslessly compressed, and you can re-upload those. So it takes away some of the grunt work on your developer side. But this is kind of the first place of attack when you're thinking about site speed. However, the one thing that PageSpeed Insights and Test My Site doesn't do is it doesn't look at the actual loading of your site on a real network or a real connection. It uses best practices, but doesn't kind of have that network effect. And so another tool that you can use is Web Page Test. And this is an external tool. You can put in any URL or any site, and it actually looks at the load on real devices, simulating real networks. And you'll get really cool analytics. It has a lot of graphs and charts that you can use to send to your developer to understand where some of the problem areas might be. And the other thing is that it creates film strips and videos. So you can actually capture a video of how your site loads on a 3G versus a 4G network and look into how it's loading and what are some of the problems. So I included here the actual test settings that we use. You want to put your URL in. A lot of times we use Nexus 5. You can select iPhone as well. And we test on Chrome. And then you want to set the network connection down below to 3G. You can run any number of tests. We usually do 3 to get a good average. And then you can actually select capture video, add a label if you want, and then just go ahead and click start test. A lot of times what we do with some of the clients that we work with is we'll look at them against their competitors and understand the larger competitive landscape. Is their site performing really well and it's going to be a competitive advantage for them to continue to work on site speed, or are they falling behind, and do you really want to prioritize this so you're not standing out as a poor user experience versus some of your competitors? So something to think about. Is a great tool, lots of analytics that you can use. The last one I want to talk about is Chrome Developer Tools, which I think is the tool that we use the most. You can actually pull it up within your Chrome browser and simulate your site under real-world conditions, just with a few quick steps. So I included on Mac and PC how to get there, but on Mac, you just go to View up at the top, kind of in your bar, Developer, and then Developer Tools. You can also right-click and click Inspect Element. And then on PC, it's if you open Chrome and then hit Control-Shift-I, or again, you can right-click and inspect element. A few settings you want to be aware of. I put them kind of in bubbles here, but for one, you can actually toggle between responsive site and a mobile phone view. So you want to make sure the mobile view is selected. 2, you want to go over and actually select the type of phone you're on. So again, we selected Nexus 5 here. You can select iPhone. There's a few different versions. 3 is where you want to hit that little video icon so you can actually create a video and a film strip of how your site loads. You can look at what's loading in first, what's last to load in above the fold. 4 is we disable cache. So you want to look at the site as if you're a new user coming to the site for the first time. Cache is where you can save actual contents on your browser, and so the next time it's a bit faster, which is a best practice. But we always want to look at it, especially from a marketing perspective, of this is a potential new user who's never been to my site before, and you want to give them the best experience. Then lastly, you select 3G. There's different settings that you can do. and then you refresh or Command R, and you can actually see how things load in, how long it takes different files. You can see that kind of waterfall over on the right, and it'll actually, under that, it'll show you the various different types of files. So you'll see that by default, it's at all, but you can also move to JavaScript, CSS, images, and fonts. You can look at different types of files to understand, how many images are on my site, are those well optimized? So those are a few of the tools I think that we use the most, that are the most helpful, and can really help get that conversation started into what are some of the optimizations that you all need to do. So let's talk about those common speed issues. I want to make sure that we all understand the principles behind why these are issues, and then identify these. And again, look at your own site. See if you can identify some of these using those 3 tools if you have them pulled up. And then take those to your developers to make sure that we're working on a fix. So I want to start with another analogy to understand, why sites are fast and what makes sites fast. And a really great analogy for this is actually moving. I don't know who has moved recently, moved apartments to a new house, but it's a total pain. But the process is very similar to how you actually load a site. So the first thing is that you can unpack the most essential items first so that your new apartment or home feels like home pretty quickly. It's also the stuff that you probably need day to day while you're unpacking. So it's important to get that stuff that you care about first quickly. The second is that ideally, you don't want to go up and down the stairs if you're moving into an apartment, and you want to eliminate the number of round trips from the moving truck to your actual room. And the third thing is that ideally you want the boxes to be as light as possible. So you might go through and actually throw some stuff out before you move. And this will just make the move a little bit faster, less friction. The same thing pretty much goes for mobile sites. And there are 3 really good principles that we kind of rely on when we're optimizing. So the first is that you want to give a good impression. We talked about this, but this is really about loading the visible content, everything above the fold, as soon as possible. You can be loading, content below the fold. You can be executing JavaScript in the background or afterwards, and that's really not going to affect the user's first experience. So this is really important, and again, we want that to be usable in about 3 seconds. The second is just to reduce the number of requests, and this is just the stuff that requires to make a website. So the code, the JavaScript, CSS, HTML, as well as things like images and fonts. And if you have to go back and forth, that's a lot of work for the server. And so fewer requests actually means faster load times. It's better to have larger files or to have fewer files that might be larger than a bunch of smaller files with the same amount of weight. The last one is just to reduce the total page weight. And again, this is the amount of stuff in those boxes. So compressing, making sure that everything is sized correctly for mobile, because lighter pages will also load faster. All right, so let's take a look at these usual suspects. And these are the ones I think that we see as we're looking through sites. Again, I work with sites of all different industries, different ranges of size of business, but they're sites that are all growing. And this is a pretty common problem. So the first one is images. Heavy images on mobile are the #1 thing that we see. And typically, on average, about 63% of page weight ends up being images. And a lot of times, especially if you're on marketing, we're used to having these large Retina desktop images, and those don't necessarily work on mobile. If you have a 500 kilobyte image that is a massive full desktop hero image, that's going to take 10 or 15 seconds to load. And that's just going to leave the user waiting for that stuff above the fold. The second one is that about 50% of mobile pages use heavy custom fonts. And a lot of times these are actually render blocking. And what that means is that nothing on the page can be rendered until the font loads in. So if you have a really heavy font, again, I know as marketers we want something really connected to our brand. We want it to be unique. But a lot of times there is actually a trade-off between having a nice custom font and having one that loads really quickly so you can get the actual information to your user. Again, on mobile, we're a lot more impatient. The third 20% of pages have more than 100 resource requests, so we talked about reducing those, prioritizing above the fold content. And then the last one is 20% of pages have about 5 redirects or more. So we want to identify those, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of what a redirect is and how you can identify it. So we'll go through these each in a bit more detail and show how to actually identify them using Chrome DevTools. So again, the first one is images. I like to use Google Keep as an example here. It is our own site, but could do a little bit better in terms of image optimization. So you can see here, I pulled the site up in Chrome DevTools, and I actually moved to the image section where you can actually pick what type of files you want to look at. And down at the bottom is nice because it actually gives a summary. So you can see that about 2.7 out of 3.1 megabytes are images, which is a massive amount. Most of the site is images. And you can see in these bottom ones here, there is an image that is 1.4 megabytes. That's huge, massive, unnecessary. So my suggestion and the solution here would be to compress images and make sure actually to avoid images that are bigger than about 100K. And 100K is about all that's necessary for loading an image like this, like a large hero image on mobile. If you have a full screen image, you might need 150K. And that's for a nice, larger phone like a Samsung Galaxy or like an iPhone 6. That should be plenty to have really good high quality images. And so a lot of times you might even compress an image and it might still be above that 100, 150 mark. You might have a 400 kilobyte image that was compressed to 250. In that case, I would work to actually go resize the image and reformat it, make sure it's JPEG, and then make sure it's compressed after that so it's around 100K. And then you want to take a look at how many images are on the page. Ideally, try to keep that below about 500K if you really do want a light, quick loading page. The second suspect here is heavy custom fonts. And then sometimes these block pages from rendering. So there's custom fonts, and then there's web fonts, which tend to be a little bit more standard, lighter across the web. Google Fonts is a great example of this, which we really do recommend using web fonts as much as possible. If you are going to use a custom font, make sure that it is compressed and gzipped. So if that way it's just compressed, the file size is smaller or as small as it can be when you're using it. The other common technique here is to use a web font and then actually lazy load a custom font, which means it'll load in later. You do get a little bit of a switch in terms of what the font looks like, but it's usually better trade-off to have something load in that the user can read and engage with versus having nothing load in and having that small kind of readjustment of what the font actually looks like. So again, this is an example here over on the left. I've gone into the font section, and you can see that there's 2 really big font files that are above 150 kilobytes each. Total, there's about 400 kilobytes of fonts on this page, and really you don't want to have more than 100 kilobytes. That should be plenty. Make sure that you're not using, loading in a bunch of fonts that you're not actually using. Try to just overall reduce the amount of fonts, and this will help a lot in terms of getting that page rendered faster. Suspect 3, again, too many requests. So again, this is trips to the server. If you think trips up and down the stairs when you're moving, all of those boxes, each of these files being a box, it takes extra time. So if you can combine those, then you can actually reduce the overall time to load the page. So the solution here is to combine many small resources into fewer large ones. Typically, if you want to talk to your developer about something to shoot for, about 20 JavaScript files max is really ideal, and then 2 CSS files. You shouldn't need much more than that. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is that, again, you want those files to be as light as possible. So try to keep JavaScript under 200 to 300 kilobytes, and CSS really below 50 is ideal, especially if you are able to work and get that down, remove a lot of unused rules. Last, 4, second to last, so prioritizing content above the fold. So again, this is an example on the left where content might not be prioritized, and you're actually loading a bunch of images and content below the fold, potentially at the same time or even before images above the fold. And so there's extra bandwidth that's being used, and the load of the above the fold content that the user cares about ends up being slower. So instead, you want to actually prioritize the content above the fold. So the hero image, that key CTA, the fonts and the logo. And then you want to load all the below the fold content afterwards. There's a lot of technical ways to do this. You'd learn more about it on the site certification, but using asynchronous loading or deferring some of that content. Then 5, this last one, is that 20% of pages have 5 redirects. And this is something not only to be aware of on your site, but also with your AdWords ads. So a redirect is where every single URL, requested URL, then goes to a different URL. So example of this is hello.com. Maybe your mobile site is actually m.hello.com/home. That's your actual homepage. So that would be one redirection. And each of those actually takes time because it has to request new content and new code. So this just slows load time, usually about a half a second. It could be anywhere, depending on how many redirects you have, to even a few seconds. And so the second example, so say you went from hello.com to m.hello.com to m.hello.com/home is the end URL that someone ends up on. That could be 2 redirections and take even more time. So the solution is to talk with your developer about removing these redirects and make sure that all of the pages are sending to the correct end URL. The other thing is to check in AdWords, and this is a really common problem that we see. You know, you might have legacy ads and some URLs on your site have updated, but if you set the final URL for one of your mobile ads to www.example.com and the actual URL that it sends to is m.example.com, that will actually slow down the load of the page and potentially add time to your ads. And so this is a really easy way to just go through and make sure that the URLs that you're sending to are the correct ones and make sure your ads, clicks off your ads are loading faster. So we talked about these 5 common problems. You know, always make sure you're compressing your images, aim for about 100 kilobytes, use web fonts, compress and minify everything, combine resources, if you can, that are similar, and identify and remove your redirects. I want to talk a little bit more about what to aim for. Again, these are a bit arbitrary, but there's always exceptions to the rule. But I think that this is pretty standard for a lot of the best-in-class sites that we see. So loading light images, individual images should be no more than 100 kilobytes, total around 500. Have light fonts, try to aim for less than 100 kilobytes in terms of font size. Have fewer lighter files. Again, we talked about this, having a total of 20 JavaScript requests, trying to keep it under 200 kilobytes. And then total of 2 CSS requests, keeping that under 50 kilobytes. And then the load of the above the fold content being under 3 seconds and having no redirects. So those are some really simple metrics that you can talk to your developers about if you're not meeting those criteria currently, and put together a plan of, you know, how are you going to address this? So again, our key takeaways: know where you stand, use the tools, and diagnose your site issues. Really dig into this because this is really important for your key metrics like bounce rate and conversion rate. You don't want to be losing customers from friction. Work with your developer team to prioritize key improvements. And I think the other thing here is create sustainable best practices. Have some checks and balances so that in the future you keep an eye on load times and implement some of these, you know, metrics to make sure that you don't, you know, make all these optimizations and then go add a megabyte image to your site and it's back to loading in 15 seconds. So the last one here is just to set speed KPIs. So above the fold content, 3 seconds, page weight under a megabyte ideally, and then requests under 80. Lastly, again, I just want to tee up, if you are interested in this or if you want to learn more about the mobile site certification, more about best practices, head to the partners portal and take the e-learning and exam. Also send this to your developers. This is a great way for them to show off their skills, make sure they're up to date. So make sure to check out that certification. All right, now we are going to head to Q&A. So give me a second to get it loaded up, and I'll try to answer a few of your questions in the next 5 or 10 minutes. All right, so we're reconnecting here. All right, so the first one I see here is, can you recommend mobile site development platforms for ad use? There's a lot of, Google Partners actually does have a way to search for development agencies, so agencies that not only do marketing, but do development. So that is an easy place that you can go to filter for a specific need or a specific location. The other thing that we work with clients a lot on is, what CMS they're using, especially ones like, WordPress, Shopify, Magento. And I think that's really dependent on the use case. There are trade-offs with each and different performance issues to take into account. So I think, specifically for ad use, it would depend on your industry, but I think that that is a key place to go. And the other one is to check out the Google Developers platform. It's called Web Fundamentals. If you search for it on Google, has a lot of those best practices and things to keep in mind in addition to the site certification. So those are just some of the resources I would use to pick a development platform or a development agency. The second question we have here is, what do you think about SVG images? SVGs are used a lot for things like icons, smaller images. We actually have a really extensive, again, on Google Developers, there's a very extensive image optimization guide that talks about different types of images, different formats, so SVG, JPEG, PNG, and when to use them. SVG images are typically okay, I think, especially in terms of icons. Something to think about is if you're using a lot of icons, to potentially turn them into a sprite. A lot of times we'll see people have 10, 15, 20 icons. And in that case, from a server perspective, you do have to do kind of round trips to pick up all of those. So a sprite can be better, and those are typically in SVG format. JPEGs are, if you're using larger images, are typically what we recommend and can be the easiest optimized. But check out that Google Developers article. It goes into a lot of depth on when and why you should use each type of image. So what is a good image compressor software? There's a few different techniques you can use. If you're looking to do one-off images or maybe a bulk upload, we use tinypng.com. It's, again, an external site. It does lossless compression, so you can get basically compressed savings with the same image quality. There's also a lot of APIs that you can use that, they depend. Some of them involve pricing depending on how many images you need to compress. Imagix is a common one that I see, especially on the retail side, if you have a retail site. So I would just do some investigation around, especially depending on what CMS system you have. But if it's a one-off image, if you're in marketing and you want to make sure you're compressing your images before you're uploading them, tinypng is a really easy to use service. All right, so I have a couple questions here on AMP mobile pages, which I'm happy to get into. We work with clients on AMP a lot, and what AMP stands for is Accelerated Mobile Pages. It is basically a landing page solution specific for mobile. So AMP started out being for publishers, so a lot of the news sites that you go to would have AMP articles, and it was made to basically be a kind of codification of the best practices that we talk about. So the pages have to be really light. It strips out a lot of the JavaScript and kind of third-party, requires that you have very little CSS, but they're still very customizable. And recently we started testing AMP for ads, and we've launched this with a few key partners. It's going really well from what we've seen in terms of, increased conversion rates and decreased bounce rates. So I would recommend going to the AMP page, which is ampproject.org. It's an open source, and that has a lot of the resources on what it takes to actually build an AMP page. There actually were 2 template services launched recently, which are really easy to use, AMP by Example and ampstart.com. And this is basically a template with various kind of custom elements like carousels, forms, buttons that are pre-templated, and then you can customize. And so you can actually build landing pages that are AMP pages. They load really quickly. Most load under a second. And so if you're thinking about, developing landing pages separate from your site, AMP is a fantastic way to build really fast, beautifully designed custom mobile pages. I think the thing to keep in mind about AMP is that it is really a landing page solution. So someone who is coming off of search is going into a landing page, and then to continue, you would actually have to go into your normal site experience. But when you're thinking about it from a marketing perspective, because speed is so important to that initial first kind of usage, that's why we've seen AMP be a really great platform for not only sites, but ads, because they load really quickly, they can be well designed, and then if you engage the user and they decide that they want to continue with your product or service, they can go through your regular site experience. How do I use Google Fonts instead of My Fonts? So My Fonts is a common platform. Google Fonts is open sourced. I would just type in Google Fonts, and you can actually download some of the common web fonts that we support. Again, a lot of these are supported across different sites and browsers. So if they're already cached, they'll load even faster. And you just want to download the font file, make sure it is compressed, and then you can actually change that out versus the current font file you're using if you're using a custom font file. There's also a lot of design services that match similar custom files to web fonts. So I'd search for some of those and see if there's a way where you could even find one that's similar to the current font that you're using, and then switch over to a web font, or either switch to a web font and lazy load the custom font that you're currently using. Let's see, I think we have time for one more here. Are there any good practices to follow when it comes to video? And there are, especially if you are using video on your landing pages. Sometimes those can be really big JavaScript files and embeds to actually load up specifically for mobile. The YouTube one is actually, I think, about 400 kilobytes of JavaScript. So there's actually a workaround that we typically recommend, which is instead of loading up the actual video on initial load, one of the things that you can do on your landing page is actually load a thumbnail of the video with that play icon, and then the video actually loads on click. So you can actually set that, and that way I would definitely not suggest auto playing video on mobile. A lot of people might not necessarily want to interact with the video. It's very timely to load up, and on mobile we tend to be much more focused on finding certain information. So if someone is going to interact with a video, then you want that to be an opt-in process versus having it play by default, which typically can be a little bit easier technically on desktop. But I would definitely say, instead of loading up the entire video file and waiting for that to load in, load just an image of the video and kind of a thumbnail, and then load the video and all of its contents on click. It may take a second or two, but the user is already engaged at that point, and you don't have to as much worry about load time. So if I didn't get to your questions, please post them. I will try and respond to them in the comments. But thank you all for attending, and we will be back next week. Have a great rest of the day.